Hello and welcome to Telios Tutors. Today's lesson will be about Mendel's laws and genetic diagrams. So first I'll start with a little bit of introduction about Mendel's work and his life. So Gregor Mendel, or the father of genetics, was an Austrian monk who trained in natural history and mathematics in Vienna University, but he was also a very keen botanist. In his garden plot at the monastery, he noticed how characteristics in plants are passed on from one generation to another. He conducted more than 5,000 experiments with pea plants, the results of which were published in 1866 and eventually became the foundation of modern genetics. Initially, his conclusions were not recognized by other people. Scientists were very skeptical as the DNA structure was discovered later and he was very much ahead of his time. This is just a table that summarizes some of the characteristics that Mendel observed. So this was the form and the cotyledons of the seed, the color of the flower, the form and the color of the pod, the place and the size of the stern. So let's take a look at one of Mendel's experiments. So Mendel crossed tall pea plants with dwarf pea plants. He was expecting to have medium-sized plants in the first generation. However, he was caught by surprise when he saw that all the plants in the first generation were actually tall pea plants. Then he performed the so-called selfing, or he crossed plants from the first generation with plants from the same generation. And then he observed a 3-to-1 ratio of tall to dwarf pea plants. So then he was able to conclude that the height characteristic of pea plants is determined by separately inherited hereditary factors, while the ratios of tall and dwarf plants in the second generation show that the unit for tall plants was a dominant over the unit for dwarf plants, as we have 3 tall plants and 1 dwarf pea plant. So, how do we call hereditary factors now? We call them genes. And how do we call hereditary units now? We call them alleles. Before we make this graph slightly more complicated, but also more informative, we'll have to make sure that we can distinguish the difference between genotype and phenotype. So, a genotype is an organism's full hereditary information, while a phenotype is an organism's actual observed properties. So let's take a look at the flow chart that will appear here. So a genotype consists of numerous amounts of genes, which can be marked with letters. Each gene has 2 copies or 2 versions, and they're called alleles. The alleles are responsible for the physical characteristic of the gene, or the phenotype. So a physical characteristic can be the height of the plants, either tall or dwarf, or the color of the flower of the plants, either violet or yellow. So 1 gene for height with 2 alleles for tall and dwarf, and 1 gene for color of the flowers of the plant with 2 alleles for violet and yellow. Okay, let's go back to Mendel's experiment. Now this graph looks slightly more complicated, but also now we're able to tell the difference between genotype and phenotype. So what is a genetic diagram? A genetic diagram is a diagram that shows the possible genes of the offspring. So as we can see here now, we have the genes of the offspring and the alleles. So before we start with some explanation of the letters here, we need to know that alleles are different versions of the same gene, and we already said that in the previous slide, but we need to make sure we understand it, and that alleles can be dominant and recessive, and dominant alleles are marked with a capital letter, while recessive alleles are marked with small letters. Okay, so very important here is that during cell division, each plant from the parental strain will form gametes. So now Mendel's first law of segregation is that each gamete will have only one allele segregated in the gamete. So in this case, of course, we have two of the same type alleles, so they will have one type of gamete containing the dominant allele. Same as for these plants, but we'll have gametes with a recessive value. When these gametes cross, we'll have plants with this genotype. When Mendel decided to cross these plants with plants from the same generation, then we have two different types of gametes because we have two different alleles. So here, by writing the gametes in the form of a table, we can obtain all the possible combinations for the genotypes of the second generation. So this gamete will cross with this gamete will mate with this one, the same for this, and then we'll have 4 plants in the second generation. 3 tall plants and 1 dwarf one. So the 3-to-1 ratio is a phenotypical ratio, while we have 2 different phenotypes, and these 2 are the same, 3 different genotypes. Something very important now is if an organism has 2 alleles of a particular gene that are the same, we call the organism a homozygous for this gene. So in this case here, we have 2 dominant alleles. So that's a dominant homozygous. And that's a recessive homozygous because we have 2 of the same alleles, but they're recessive ones. Of course, if we have different alleles for a particular gene, the organism is heterozygous for these genes. And this is the case here and here as well, of course here as well. So we have 2 different alleles. Okay, to summarize, characteristics are determined by genes. Mendel's law of segregation is during gamete formation, the alleles for each gene segregate from each other, so that each gamete carries only one allele for each gene. Mendel's law of dominance is that alleles can be dominant or recessive, and if an organism has both the dominant and the recessive alleles for a characteristic, the dominant characteristic will be expressed. So this is the case here, where we have both a dominant and a recessive allele, and that means that the dominant characteristic will be expressed and we'll have tall pea plants. If an organism has 2 recessive alleles for a characteristic, then the recessive characteristic will be expressed. So 2 recessive alleles, the recessive characteristic will be expressed, and we'll have dwarf pea plants. The only chance of a recessive characteristic to be expressed is where the 2 recessive alleles are together. Okay, so a little bit of practice. So we have the gene for color of the flower. So if that is the dominant allele and it is responsible for the violet color of the flowers, and that is the recessive one, which is responsible for the white color of the flowers. Then if we have these genotypes, what do you think the phenotype will be? So basically here, as we have a dominant allele, we'll have a violet color, and same as here. So we have the presence of the dominant allele, so then again we'll have a violet color. And here we have two recessive alleles, so in this case only we'll have white color of the flowers. So yeah, that was just a quick practice question, and that was the end of today's session. I hope you enjoy it, and I will see you next time. Are together.